Yeah, today's subject is on this whole area of operational and hygiene audits, GMP audits. And, you know, I mean, while it's probably not the most exciting aspect of food safety, I think it is, you know, arguably one of the more important areas, because it is one of those fundamentals that you need to get right to assure safe food production. So I think it's worth our while spending a little bit of time on it, talking about it, some of the principles and practices that should be considered when pulling this sort of program together in a food business. So that's the subject today, and so let's kick off. Before we do, just a quick reminder that you can access a variety of tools and other materials from our resource page on safefood360.com. That might be useful because I will present a couple of free tools that we have up on our website, which you can download and can help in this whole area here. Just a brief introduction on myself. So I'm CEO of SafeFood360. I've been knocking around the food industry for quite some time now, over 30 years, in various roles and functions, lab technician, manager, consultant, and more laterally as the chief executive of a software business providing solutions to the food industry. So that's my background. Okay, so a brief introduction. So what exactly are operational audits, this whole subject that we're going to be talking about for an hour? Well, most of you will be familiar with the requirements to conduct basic sort of inspections and checks on the standards that operate in food businesses. So these are kind of basic standards, basic practices, they're prerequisites for the safe and legal production of food products. The underlying concept really is that no matter how excited you might get about your HACCP plan and how good it is, unless it's underpinned by robust prerequisite programs, it cannot in and of itself assure safe food production, your HACCP plan, I mean, in that case. So you have to get what we usually call in Ireland the bread and the butter of it's correct. And you may call these inspections or audits by something different. Some of the other names used would be GMP audits, GHP, prerequisite program audits, hygiene audits, you know, pre and post-production audits, or positive release, and there are more, I'm pretty sure, but there are some more of the common names that we would use to describe them. And practically, what is involved in these inspections, as I'm sure you know, is kind of somebody, some human being typically going around doing lots of visual inspections of the standards that are present in food operations, the hygiene standards, the housekeeping standards, and so on. They can also include, depending on your approach, inspection and tests of certain process parameters or product parameters even sometimes. You may be doing ATP swabs, you may be checking for allergens and that type of stuff. So that can all be included. So other things, you could be checking chemical concentrations, you know, temperatures of you know, water baths for sanitizing knives. It doesn't really matter, it depends. But they're kind of typically operational focus. And the checks all seek to answer one fundamental question, and I've just articulated the question there on the screen. So, are the fundamental and the operational standards for safe food production in place? And are they in place now? That's typically a strong character of these types of audits. You're trying to establish what's going on at this moment in time, because you want to do something typically subsequent to that, you know, decision, produce product, for example. And they do presuppose in many ways that someone has at some point in time actually sat down and looked at and thought about what exactly are these standards we're talking about. And the question is often asked as well, how often do we need to check them? Okay, so that's just kind of a summary of the nature of what these audits are about. Now, before we kind of get into some of the discussions around how to approach this, I thought it might be interesting just to discuss for a little bit a key underlying principle of these audits, and indeed food safety management in general, because it's often overlooked, or people may not, have the time to, sit down and ask, well, what exactly are we doing here with this food safety management system? It might sound like an obvious question, but very often can be overlooked. Now, for many food businesses, we know that we need to do these audits because a customer demands it. It could be a contractual requirement, certainly present in the GFSI standards, or you may have to do it for legal reasons as well. And very often, for most food companies, that's good enough. We don't actually need to maybe understand the true nature of things. We just need to understand the fact that we have to do it. That's fine. But there can often be a lack of understanding of why. And the reason that might be a concern is sometimes if you don't understand clearly why you're doing something, you may not be able to do it effectively, or you may be overdoing it and wasting time and money in the process. So the typical scenario you could have in a food business is, so why do we, so we actually do, say, pre-production audits on all our production lines before each shift, for example. And we want to positively release the line once all those requirements are met. So that kind of is a description of the type of scenario which governs why audits, operational audits, are in fact done. Okay, so let's just. Okay, so some of these main activities which we check, for example, are typically predefined on schedules in food safety. So, for example, cleaning, pest control, training, glass and plastic. And what we're saying here is that if you actually look at a lot of things that we do in food safety management, they occur on a repeating cycle. So we clean according to this schedule, we inspect for pests according to another schedule, we train people up, and we check to make sure all glass and plastic is intact. So the key character of everything we do in food safety is related in some way to a frequency or a time interval. And that's important because underlying that, there's an assumption that if these activities are not conducted on this frequency or they're not conducted effectively, at some point in time, the operation will go from being what is safe for food production to being not so safe. So there is, in fact, kind of a tipping point that's reached that's based on frequency and based on time, and not necessarily the intrinsic risk itself. And that's particularly the case for non-CCP controls or general PRPs, for example. And let me explain a little bit more about what I'm talking about here because it's helpful. Here's an example, okay? So in the food factory, we know that bacteria, if they're allowed, will grow on surfaces. They'll particularly grow if you give them enough food, enough heat, and enough water to do that. They're not obviously dissimilar to ourselves. We like all those things. We also know that cleaning removes the levels of these bacteria should they start to grow, and obviously other controls as well. By removing these factors, we can then reduce the levels of these bacteria to a level that's acceptable. And here again, we see the introduction of an event, a time-based event, which gives us offers some level of control. Okay, but here's the key point: at some point, there is a shift, a qualitative shift in the level of risk, based on some accumulation of events over time, and that's key to understanding auditing and why we audit, and to the extent that we audit as well. Okay, so this is not actually a new concept. Those of you who like to read philosophy don't usually call philosophers in food safety, but I thought maybe on a subject like auditing, I might just break it up a little bit. But you might be familiar with this guy, Friedrich Hegel, a philosopher, and he was kind of very good at explaining his observations about the world in which we live in, and the character of systems in nature, I suppose. And he understood that it was typical in nature where you kind of have this quantitative addition of an event, a drip by drip sort of addition almost, that you eventually, each individual quantity in of itself may not lead to any issues, but there is at some point a qualitative shift in what's happening, and that's not new. I mean, the nature, the dialectical nature of nature itself demonstrates that to us every day. And the idea or the philosophy is found good application in politics, economics, and various other fields. And it does, in fact, underpin a lot of what we do in risk assessment in food safety. We know from our probability by severity model that what's actually underpinning that is an attempt to identify, that transformation between small quantitative changes into a qualitative shift in what's happening. That's the point. It's almost a critical point, if you like. Okay, so in understanding that, then, we can see applications of it, even in the food industry. For example, load testing of materials is exactly the same sort of model. You apply a little bit of pressure to a body, it won't crack or break, but you keep applying bit by bit. There will be a breaking point at which it will snap. Those of you familiar with analytical chemistry will know, titration is sort of a similar principle. You have an unknown solution, you have a known solution, and you want to determine the unknown concentration. You can use an indicator that will give you a color change, usually when the final drop goes in. Usually it's instant, some cases that's not. But probably the most common analogy we can give is, the straw that breaks the camel's back. So, one straw in the camel's back won't cause a qualitative change in the integrity of the animal, but you keep adding them on in theory, and eventually one straw will tip that camel over, breaking its back. Okay, and that's the fundamental concept behind everything I suppose we do in trying to assess risks relating to hazards in food safety. But it's not as easy as we think. In fact, it can be quite challenging. So to be able to actually identify the point at which the accumulation of quantities transform into a qualitative shift in what we're doing in terms of food safety can often require lots of analysis, experimentation, and that is just not practical in most food businesses. And we bridge that gap. We bridge it through things like guidance documents, standards, criteria, data we collect day to day, the knowledge and experience of the food safety practitioner, and all of these things contribute and help. Okay, so operational and GMP audits then can be conducted at a frequency which is based on this risk assessment, and they're specifically designed to find the tipping point, but take action before we reach it. Okay, and that's why we may do operational audits and we do other activities in food safety. Okay, so I hope that just gives you a little bit more insight into the nature of what we're trying to do, and then we'll just maybe take a little look at hazards and contamination, because ultimately this is what we're attempting to manage, are these things called hazards and how they actually make their way into the food chain and the operations that we do. So there's many sources of these hazards in food production. They come from a variety of places. And I've just represented them here on the screen for you. So people, obviously, food handlers, the equipment we use, pests, we need to manage those, the environment, and so on. Ingredients and packaging, yep, we're introducing into the products, obviously, and facilities. So there's quite a lot of opportunity and quite a lot of sources from which these hazards can originate, and this is the reason it's so complex to identify in food safety those points at which we need to take action. Okay, so one of the ways we do it is through these pre-operational and GMP audits, and these tend to be very systematic in nature, and really what they're trying to do is they're trying to determine whether or not standards are in place as they're set out and as they're planned, and that plan normally is the HACCP plan that we're looking at. Okay, quick look at the requirements framework. I won't dwell on this for too long, but we can see, for example, in the BRC, they recommend, or I think they require actually, that the cleanliness, for example, of equipment should be checked before you release it back into production. Okay, we'll talk about that release element later in the slide deck. The results of the checks and cleaning and the visual inspections, the analytics, the micro checks shall be recorded and used to identify trends in cleaning performance and to instigate improvements where required. So that 4.11.5 from the BRC kind of encapsulates everything that we've just spoken about. You need to check that's your operational audit. Ideally, you'd like to collect data from that, and that data helps you by trending or analysis identify where that tipping point may be and where you can take actions. So that's nicely described there. SQF edition 9, similarly, regular inspections of the site and the equipment shall be planned, that's scheduled, and carried out to verify that the practices are in place. You need to take corrective actions and maintain records. So again, we can see that there's a clear requirement for these. FSSC 22K, again, the organization shall establish, implement, maintain routine site inspections, PRP checks, audits again. So this is a very clear requirement, and it's a very logical and I think reasonable one for food safety management. But what it's saying is we need to conduct these things called operational audits. And what exactly are audits? A few slides just to discuss that, guys. Okay, so they're basically a systematic, independent and documented process for obtaining audit evidence and evaluating it to determine if you're doing what you're saying you should be doing or the criteria. Keywords there obviously is a systematic, what that means there should be plans, they should be documented, you should have clear thinking around why you audit, when you audit and how you audit and what you check. Okay, so it shouldn't be a kind of an open sort of program in your operation. Should be well thought out, well planned, structured and documented. Should be independent, that's clear. All audits should ideally be independent from the responsibility for the operation. Needless to say, you don't want a line manager auditing the hygiene conditions of their own line, probably not best practice. Okay. Audit evidence is just basically what you observe or the data that's collected, and the evaluation objectively, obviously you want to keep it as scientific as possible, to basically answer the question, are you fulfilling the requirements? Where do operational audits sit in the overall framework of food safety management? Guys, this is just a slide I tend to use a lot with the postgrads in the university. This encapsulates all of what food safety management is about. So I'm not going to go into it at all. You'll be pleased to hear. But I just do want to point out that operational audits live in this area here, which is the verification of the food safety plan. So it's a verification activity. And what we mean by that is very simple, is that we are looking for evidence that the activities and the way we do things in the food business to produce safe food are being conducted according to how we say they should be. Okay, we're not really asking the question, is it good enough? We're just simply looking to answer the question, are we doing it as we said we would? Validation seeks to answer a different question. It's basically saying, well, all the stuff that we are doing and we're checking and verifying, is it in fact capable of producing a safe food product? So it's validating it more, you know, the hypothesis almost that what we're doing is good enough. Okay, so, but it's a verification activity. It's really about checking. Okay, it is a very effective and it is a very reliable tool in food safety management. It's probably one of the most widely used tools in food safety management. Checking, inspection, auditing. You know, to what extent it actually, you know, contributes to safer food production. That would be a whole other day's discussion. But it certainly is the most widely used verification tool that we have. There's a few key elements to do an auditing correctly. Just have a few slides up here just to show that. So we have these two sort of elements, which are, you know, the sum of these two make up for a good auditing program. Now, the first of them is the audit standard, guys. Okay, and that basically is your criteria. It's your specifications, your policies, your procedures, your requirements. This is what we want to do. And that's your audit standard. Now, coupled with that, Okay, sorry, just as Ben mentioned, those standards can come from a variety of places. There's no hard and fast rule about that. So they could be legal requirements, or they could be GFSI standards like the BRC, customer standards, or indeed your own internal standards as well. So a lot to consider there. So the other key component of good auditing, it may seem obvious, is a competent auditor. So it doesn't matter how well you define the requirements. If the person doing the inspection, doing the check and the audit is not competent to do it, the quality of your audit and the outputs will be most likely to be poor. So competency can vary depending on the type of audits you're doing. Needless to say that if you're auditing a third-party audit on a food business for the full requirements of the BRC standard, you will need a certain level of competence there. If you're doing daily hygiene audits on a production line, there's a different set of skills perhaps that are required there as well. Okay. So on the screen here, guys, I just pulled together all those elements. You should ideally have, as an auditor, knowledge of the rules that are relevant, the regulations. Knowledge of HACCP is helpful. The principles of food safety, the principles of risk, the principles surrounding hazard identification, those things can all be quite helpful. Education and work experience to the extent that it's required. Auditor training, it's never a wasted time. Just some basic skills about how auditors can perform and conduct themselves. Personal attributes can also help as well. Having a good attention to detail, objectivity, a certain degree of integrity helps. All of these personal attributes contribute. Now, obviously, this perfect human being that I have up on the screen here, none of us meet that requirement. But there are some basics that you'll desirably want in your auditors. Okay. Okay, let's take a closer look at the operational audit itself. There's various types, and there is a hierarchy of audits in food safety, or at least there should be, if you're doing risk assessment rights. And I've just depicted these on the screen for you. So this is not in tablets of stone, guys, but it's just my kind of view of it. So we have this hierarchy, or it's ascending upwards, typically based on the detail, the technical detail, probably the skills levels as well. But we have initially the pre-production audit, for example, and they're typically daily or per batch or per shift or production run, whatever the local setup is. Stepping up one level, then we might have these hygiene audits, not conducted quite as frequently as the pre-production or post-production audits. Perhaps maybe weekly, certainly monthly, perhaps, depending on the risk. Then just moving up again, we might have these kind of PRP audits, general prerequisites, maybe operational ones. Definitely probably based on risk, but less frequent than the previous two. And these three represent what I would sort of term operational audits. Now, moving up again, we could have these HACCP audits, more focused on the HACCP plan, more focused on critical points of control. Could be 6 monthly. These are just taken from the top of my head, guys, based on experience, but you get the picture. And you may do a full compliance audit of your entire food safety system on an annual basis, particularly if you're GFSI certified, you would certainly do that. Okay, so that's the hierarchy. It's just breaking it out a little bit more for you. Now, the emergence of the operational audit has been interesting, actually. So when I, many years ago, started out in the food industry, all auditing was operational auditing. Food safety was primarily based on, checking cleaning standards and, the visual aspects and the more physical aspects of food production. Desk audits for, fancy management systems and all that stuff. It was coming in, but it wasn't really the main focus. And it did over years become the main focus. And I remember at one point, years ago, being present in audits where there was hardly any sort of walk through the food factory. It was all about the paperwork and the systems. Now, I'm pleased to say that that's shifted back, and we seem to be back at a very sensible balance between factory audit and the desk audit and the paperwork. So we've seen that shift over time. Back again, the pendulum has swung back, which is very good and positive. It happened for a simple reason: is that food companies could practically be running virtually any standard for producing their products, and could pass a GFSI audit at one point with barely anybody taking a look at the production facilities. So that's just the way things go. It's not an issue, but things have got back to where they should be, which is good. Okay, so operational checks then, based on the key assumption: if the conditions of production are right, then the food, we assume, should also be right. When I say right, I mean safe or legal. Issues do happen, of course, from time to time, and they should be checked ideally in the moment prior to that, to that adverse impact taking place. Okay. Okay, so the character of operational audits. Okay, the focus has to be on checking and not auditing. That's typically the fundamental character of an operational audit. You're really just it's getting down to it: is something done or is it not done? Is something okay or is it not okay? So it can be quite binary in nature, and that's fine. And are the chemical concentrations for the cleaning bath at the right levels, for example? So it's very, very much hard. Just get it sorted and find out, is that in fact the case? Based on specific production windows, production lines, and batch runs. So again, this brings back in the element of frequency. Very often it's based on a certain frequency, and that frequency needs to be logical. It needs to be based on risk as far as you understand the risk. So no point in checking whether a production line has been cleaned correctly once a week when contamination can build up to an unsafe level after one production run. So for a good example could be comminuted meat or minced meat. You get one dodgy batch coming in, going through the mincer plates, and you need to be checking it after each production run or each batch. Otherwise, you're inoculating your entire day or week's production, for example. So that's risk assessment, understanding the process, and understanding when the tipping point arrives. These are typically high-frequency inspections, operational checks. Corrective actions need to be defined. No point in inspecting if you don't have a concept and understanding of what the action should be. And the action should be pretty much instantaneously available and triggered. Based on very specific requirements or specifications, and again, integrated fully into your normal operation activities and not separated from them. And that's very important. Good practice dictates that these operational checks should all, where possible, be owned by the individuals who are operating the process. You give up ownership to them to make sure that they check their own stuff. Now you can verify that obviously at a different level in your organization. There's no problem with that either. I'll talk to you about how that can be done in a moment. But ideally, you want the ownership at the level at which the risk is either introduced or mitigated. And that involves training, education, supervision, support to get that right. Okay, so what exactly should be included in the operational check? So you should really include what is crucial and important. Okay, so what is absolutely important for safe food production, legal food production, or quality production, and you shouldn't really have anything more in it than that. Okay, if you need to start putting more in, then it's not operational. It needs to get bumped up the hierarchy of audits into something else. Okay, ideally, what you're checking should be clearly measurable. So when I say that, that could be a visual inspection along the lines of, well, something is in fact present or not present, or it could be an actual measurement, a numerical value, or some attribute value as well. Okay. You should only include in your operational checks what you can reasonably actually put in there. So there's no point in asking people to check for the sun, moon, and stars when it's a pre-production audit designed just to make sure that you can actually get production going. Okay, so be very discerning about it. Make sure it has value when you put it into the checklist for your audit. Make sure the address is something specific that you want to control and make sure is right. Okay. Hygiene audits, yeah, typically will cover, the fundamentals of the environment, the floors, walls, your drains, your pumps, etc. So spend time when you're designing your operational audits to look at all these things, make a judgment. Are they important enough to be included in the daily checks, the hourly checks, the production checks, whatever the frequency you are operating to? Prerequisites as well, you can include things such as your pest control, housekeeping, that type of stuff, perfectly good. If it has a direct impact on what you are producing and what you want to achieve in your operation. Personal hygiene standards, definitely, it's always a present. Our staff appropriately kitted out with PPE. There's hand washing practices up to standard, jewelry, all those kind of things. And then your equipment, your utensils, and cleaning chemicals and standards. So it's very much about housekeeping. Is everything that should be in place in place? Is everything set up correctly? Is everybody doing what they're supposed to be doing? And if all those answers are yes, then you're good to go. You can set about producing products reasonably confident that at the other side, it'll be safe, it'll be legal, and of good quality. You can, depending on the operation and the process, include inspections around tanks and silos, the security of them, the integrity of them, things like sieves, filters, magnets, all of these things. And you may ask the question, well, how do I know? Well, you should know if your HACCP assessment has been conducted in sufficient detail. So you will, during your HACCP study, you will filter out and separate out lots of these elements which aren't critical, like things such as metal detectors, perhaps, maybe sieves, magnets, things of that nature. But when you separate them out as being non-critical, it doesn't mean they go away, and they probably should find themselves present on some control program, and that may in turn transfer into an operational or hygiene audits requirement list as well. Okay. Quick note about risk assessment, and I'm going to guys show you a nice little tool. It's free. It's up on the Safe Foods resource page. So do just go in there, download it, and have a look. It's an Excel workbook, so everybody can use it. It's designed to help you structure your risk assessment around determination of how you do your operational audits, the frequency, the risk, and the corrective actions arising from them. Okay, this is about determining your audit plan, and it's quite useful. So if you take a look at the BRC or any other standards like that, you're going to come across the phrase hygiene audits and checks should be conducted at a frequency based on an assessment of risk. Okay, the reason it's saying that is you should audit at a frequency that's appropriate to the risk in your operation. It's good for you because it means you don't end up auditing everything that moves in the food factory. You can separate them out, and you can focus your resources where they're needed most. Okay, so it's a very useful tool, and the tool I'm about to show you will just help you out a little bit on that. Okay, so that's the Excel tool, guys. It's I know that might look a bit overwhelming, but don't worry, I'm going to break it down for you. Okay, so in the first section here, we have this risk assessment model. In this model, we just use a simple 3x3. We don't need to go crazy with 5x5 or any other model. This is just a suggestion. You may want to do it in a different way, of course. Okay, so you can see severity by probability, and we just have a little note here explaining what this is about. Okay, so that's your model. And what you're looking at doing is risk assessing. Or you're asking the question, how often do I need to audit this? And this can be, naturally, it could be a procedure, a process, or it could be, say, a production line and the elements of a production line and the activities of a production line. It doesn't matter. You can use it for different scenarios. Okay, so yes, so this is our model. We want to put some meat behind these values. This is all standard stuff, guys. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but let's define the probability criteria. So remember, we're talking here about operational audits, and number one, failure of the activity being audited is likely to happen. It's rare or remote. Okay. Failure of the activity being audited can happen, but not frequently. That's number two, value of 2. And number 3, failure of the activity being audited is very likely to happen often and frequent. So what we're saying here, here's an example. What's the likelihood of the cleaning on this machine not to happen properly? And we determine that by checking it, an operational audit check. Okay, so you're asking the question, what's the likelihood of that cleaning not happening? Is it frequent or is it not frequent? Then the severity criteria. So what we're asking here as well, look, in the event that it does fail, the activity which we are auditing, if the activity was to say fail, what would be the likely impact of that, or the severity of that impact? And again, here's just an example, guys. The failure of the activity being audited is unlikely to pose an immediate or grave risk to the consumer. Failure of the activity being audited is unlikely to pose an immediate risk, but repeated failure over time may. See, hopefully you're getting the picture here, guys. We're really just pinning down the logic, the approach, the underlying methodology of the risk assessment to build this operational audit program. Number 3, failure of the activity being audited is likely to lead to an immediate or grave health impact, excuse me, recall or regulatory issue. Okay, so that's grand. We're building our model up nicely. And if we happen to rate the activity which we're going to audit as a low, medium, high, then we can determine how frequent we want to audit them. Okay, so these are just examples. Again, audit the activity at a frequent level, minimum every 3 months. So that could be every week. It depends on your appetite for risk, guys, and your product. Okay, so that's great. Now, so you're after building the model. There's just some special points of attention. Okay, now next thing you need to do is just list out everything that you want to check. So you might say list out all your cleaning programs, all your cleaning tasks in your operation on this list. I've just thrown some random examples up there. So that could be cleaning procedure for say sieves, cleaning procedure for chocolate enrobing machine, whatever the case is. List them all out, and then you can get to work. Just give them a brief description, drop in your probability by severity, get your risk, and make your decision then about the frequency of the audits. Now, trust me, if you take this approach, guys, your auditors coming in the door, they will like you a lot. You're making their job so easy, and you're demonstrating to them without uttering a word that you understand why you audit and the frequency to which you audit. And so, yeah, auditors like this, they get happy, and happy auditors make for good audit outcomes. So, as I say, guys, just download it. Fundamental underlying all of this is this principle. Again, if you have an accumulation of failed events over time, individually, they won't cause a problem, but you add them up, and at a sufficient number of them accumulate, you're going to get a tipping point over into an unsafe event. And your audits are set at this frequency here to prevent this event 5 happening. Okay, so again, I just dropped that slide in there just to go back and reinforce the original point so you understand exactly why you're setting those audits at a certain frequency. Okay, so let's just talk about positive release, guys, because this presentation is not about the A, B's, and C's of doing hygiene audits. You guys already know how to do that, and I won't waste your time today telling you again, how you're doing your job. But we're interested today about best practice and getting the most from this activity as well, operational auditing. The positive releases is one of those ways which you can extract a lot of value from your activities of auditing. It provides a lot of protection, not just to the consumer, but to the business as well. If you can get your operation to the point where you can distill down in nice, concise operational checklists, those things which effectively determine how safe and how legal and the quality of your product, and you can positive release against them, then you're in a very, very strong position. It's not always possible. absolutely to do it. That's an obvious thing. But if you can distill it down to this level of positive release, then you have a really, really robust, strong food safety management system. Okay, let's talk about positive release. So operational checks are most potent when they're coupled with positive release. That's the point I'm trying to make with you. Operational checks are fantastic in their own right, don't get me wrong, coupled with positive release, and then you're onto something very exciting. It's affirmation that the conditions that you've checked off can in fact produce the safe product. And if you can couple that with a no-run policy, what that means in plain English, guys, is if you don't reach the point of positive release, in other words, we've met all the requirements, we know these requirements represent a safe batch. We're not in a position to actually meet those requirements, so we're not going to release, and we have a no-run policy coupled with that, then again, you're onto another layer of protection. Now, guys, I want to make it absolutely clear. I've worked in food businesses for years. I know that no-run policies are not always possible, or economically possible, or operationally or technically. You may have customers who will just absolutely insist on it, but in the absence of no-run policies, you can have pretty good systems to isolate and segregate the products. You could have, say, a no-ship policy, for example, or no distribution policy as well. Okay, so here we're talking about good practice, guys. Taking what would appear to be a mundane thing, such as operational checklists and audits, and bringing it up into a sophisticated business policy for protection. That's worth your time and efforts to figure that out. Formal sign-off and release, that's always good. And escalation procedures where required, that can be valuable as well. Okay. For continuous processes, a system of pyramid to continue can also be used. Okay, so just again, it's about tying things down, not necessarily making things over bureaucratic. That doesn't help anybody either. Businesses have to produce food product, and they have to sell it, and they have to ship it, otherwise they can't realize value in what they're doing. But nonetheless, the costs of getting it wrong quickly undermine that. So if you can extract any of this or from your systems, that's an improvement. And if it's consistent with good quality, efficient production of food, then you really are onto a winner. Okay, corrective actions, just a quick note about those. Pretty standard, guys. Just spend a little time actually, figuring out what the appropriate corrective action is if an element or an item of your audit or your check isn't met. Okay, so you want it figured out in advance rather than trying to figure it out when it happens. Okay, you should try to avoid full-scale CAPA processes, particularly from operational checks. So that is also another interesting character about your hygiene audits and your operational checks. If they're leading to a full CAPA, full corrective action process, then a couple of things could be going on. One is they probably shouldn't be on that checklist. Their level of risk is just so high. Maybe it should be on something else, like a CCP or something, for example. Or you may be getting a kind of repeated occurrence of the issue, and maybe that could justify a CAPA process naturally. But if you're getting a repeated full CAPA, that's not great. So ideally, correction, local correction, and fast correction of the issues should be an intrinsic nature of what these checks as well. Okay. Quick word about checklists. Obviously, you have to build them. Spend time doing them. Think about them. Make sure that everything on the checklist has clear value, and that's underpinned by some clear decision for it to be there. Okay. Design them well. Design them easy to use. Make sure it's covering the scope of what you need to produce safe products. Very important. Try and build in the positive release workflow into that document as well, if you can. And you should always be checking and reviewing these, guys. I mean, I used to do a lot of audits years ago. I can't tell you how many times I looked at these hygiene checklists, and they were so old that they didn't hardly resemble the factory they were in. I think that sort of stuff is less common these days. But you should really be looking at them and checking them out all the time. Absolutely, if something changes in your process, your operation in some way, they should be reviewed immediately. There's an example, guys, of what a checklist may look like. So you can break it down by area, by room, by chapter. There's no rules. It's what best suits the concrete situation for you on the ground. So, you know, try and keep it as concise as possible. You really don't want long-winded chapter and verse of what should happen. If you do, it means maybe your auditor is not fully trained, not fully competent. You probably need to go back to the drawing board on that one, I would say. Okay, so are all sockets and switches intact and clean, etc.? You can have a yes or no response to that, good or bad, compliant, non-compliant. Good practice, though, if you can, would be to introduce a scoring system, because nothing is ever black or white, particularly in food companies. So a nice scoring system there could help. Simple enough. You know, 1 is good, 2 is not so good, 3 is unacceptable. The reason scoring is useful is because it allows you to start trending your performance. And best practice, if you want another top tip on best practice, is trend your data. Yeah, that will tell you more about your food business than you know, hours and hours and hours and hours of analysis and you know, just you know, walking around your factory 24/7. These trends will emerge over time if you design this correctly, and hugely useful. Okay, what else do we have? Yep, record your comments, your observations. Important if you want to go back and take actions. One really nice tip is if you do have a tool or the ability to take photographs of things when they go wrong, certainly by all means, I think that's good practice. It can help people take corrective actions as well. Let me just progress here. Okay, checklist can also be of this design where you set out a prescribed list of tests or checks. That could be, is it correct? What's the temperature? What's the pressure? What's the concentration? Does the color look right? So these, you know, so these are inspections as well, but you very often in food companies see them integrated with one another. Checks, audits with these kind of practical results as well. So just bear that in mind. Good example of how you can put photograph taken to good effective use. So if, for example, people on the production line are doing their own pre-production or post-audit checks, great idea for them to take a picture where relevant of the check they've just done. It's an amazing thing about human nature that when you ask someone to take a photograph of what they've just done, they tend to do it right all the time. And we all understand the process involved in there. Okay, so if, for example, if you're getting somebody to possibly release a production item after it's been cleaned, a photograph of that machine post-cleaning will effectively assure that it is in fact done right, regardless of what the checklist done. So that's another tip for good practice, if you can acquire such a tool to assist you in doing that. Verification and release is very important as well. So, you know, verification could be based on different things. So this could be a post-production audit or check, and you could define the ATP levels, things such as allergen testing, and so on. Okay, to get the idea, guys, it's quite open and flexible. Positive release, again, you can use photographs for that too. So what I've done here, guys, just a few slides just to wrap up here. I've just summarized the process here. I won't go into it in detail, we've covered it, that you can take and you can adopt in building your operational audit program. Again, it's just a suggestion, but helpful just to tick off the appropriate steps in doing that. Now, just one final slide is just to talk about artificial intelligence, because going back to the discussion we had earlier, you know, the fundamental kind of principle driving audits, these operational audits, is figuring out when that tipping point is from safe to unsafe, and ideally trying to catch it before it happens. It's a very basic principle. I don't need to go on about it too much more. But there could be opportunities. So if you design your audits well, and particularly if you're recording some sort of quantitative data, pass and fail even is good enough. You will collect an awful lot of data, and I guarantee you, most of you guys out there who are working in food business have collected a massive volume of information and data from these audits. It's lying in pretty, two-dimensional form. But within it, there is a huge amount of valuable data. If you could only get your hands on it and do something with it, it could help. That's for sure. It could indeed, arguably, it could help you predict when the failure point is going to take place based on certain events. So let me just show you the rough example. Everybody's getting very excited about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all that stuff. I don't pretend to be an expert in it, guys. I'm not, okay? But one thing I do know is that while there's huge excitement in the industry about these technologies, things have been very slow in terms of finding practical applications for them. Now, that's for various reasons that we won't go into now, but it's clear that there's a great unlocked potential in these tools and in these new technologies of finding practical applications, particularly in the food business, haven't been quite so easy to come by. But here's one example for that. So today we're talking about audits, and over here, guys, is the current situation, current state. So you have an audit, you do your checks, you will respond yes or no. So it's good or it's bad. Usually that's how we do it. We give it a tick. Nothing wrong with that. It serves a very good function and purpose. But regardless of that response which the auditor makes, it's pretty standalone. It doesn't have too much more to it than or any other insight except that in the auditor's judgment, it's okay or it's not. Okay. So a future state may look like taking such a checklist, but you can also maybe make it more intelligent. So, for example, we had a question here: is the manufacturing area clean and sanitized? The answer could be yes, and that's fine. If it's no, then it's just marked down and you address the issue. However, you could take the same question, and if you get a negative, no, it's not clean. Okay, let's say take question 3: are food handlers all wearing the correct protective clothing? In this case, you would say no, and then you would probably go up and address the person and say, listen, you'll obviously do that. But very often you need to do a little bit more. There's other factors going on, and you may decide to ask additional questions to get more insight into the actual risk. So this is converting, in many ways, a verification tool, like an audit checklist, into a risk assessment tool as well. And already we've upped the game significantly. So we know the food handler is not fully complying with the standards on protective clothing. Is the food handler then working directly in exposed food areas? And that's a different question from if they aren't. So the answer is yes. Well, okay, well, that's interesting. Okay, so the risk has just gone up slightly here. Are they exposed to ready-to-eat high-risk foods directly? And again, that could be no, and you may have to take a different approach. But the answer is yes. Okay, so now we're really interested in this initial audit finding. Is there a clear and immediate risk of contamination? And again, if the answer is yes, then the trigger could be, well, listen, we need to stop production here. We need to isolate product, etc. So that's one example, not necessarily artificial intelligence, it's not, but I'll take it to something now in a moment. But that is a good example of how we can make our checklists more intelligent and transform them quite easily into a risk assessment tool, real time on the ground. Far more useful than simply just recording a failure and taking kind of a generic blanket action for it. Okay, so let's just continue this on a little bit more, guys. Where are we? Okay, so we're still keeping our intelligent checklist here. So are food handlers all wearing the corrective protective clothing? No, they're not. Then we're after going through and asking another series of questions here. We've got our automatic outputs, which is, again, our corrective action predefined. Now we can automate those actions using digital technologies. But behind all of this is a pretty useful set of data. guys. And over time, what you're actually building up is a profile of risk and the probability of risk occurring should you get a response to a particular question. Okay, so if over time, your audits start to produce results that leads to, say, an adverse outcome such as product failing for, say, microbiological tests or a recall, you arguably can actually, by analyzing that data over time, figure out, well, what was the concrete inputs or conditions that led to that failure? And with the appropriate analytical software, appropriate valid algorithms, you can start to calibrate the probability of that happening. So, for example, if you had enough data on this particular, well, it's effectively it's kind of very, very rudimentary algorithm, you could start over time building up the capacity to state events in this format here. So we know, based on lots of data on this issue, that there's now an 84% probability of contamination of food handlers on line 1. Okay, and so here's a great example, guys, of how what we usually have traditionally viewed as a very sort of mundane exercise, which is an operational audit checklist, transforming into something quite different, an extremely valuable tool capable of protecting consumers, businesses, brands, and goodwill from events, long before we even reach them. Okay, so conceptual at this stage, absolutely, guys. But we are working on something like this, and we're excited about it. And I think people can be justifiably excited about what AI can bring. Our challenge, of course, in the industry is figuring out useful applications, and I believe, and I would suggest that something like this is very, very useful. Okay, I think that might be the end of my presentation, Simon. It is, and so more than happy to take any questions if there are some.
Yep, there are, George. Yeah, thanks very much for that. Really great. So what we'll do is, if you switch your webcam on, George, we'll go for 10 minutes maximum, and see. Because obviously it was supposed to be an hour, we're already over, but we'll definitely take some questions, see where we get to. Okay, so Hamid, first of all, can you see that? Can you see the questions in the sidebar? The one I've highlighted.
Yeah.
Right. So Hamid, is there a difference between this review and what is known as internal audit or first-party audit?
Well, no. What I've described today is an internal audit or first-party audit. But in this case, they're just those operationally focused internal audits, as opposed to maybe auditing your HACCP system or auditing the requirements of your BRC standard that you're operating to. It's just kind of separation of day-to-day sort of stuff from high-level management processes. Yeah.
Okay. Dilanka, let's highlight that one for you. Audits assist in identifying root cause, and it might lead to long-term corrective actions. Could you please explain about how to analyze the root cause of an identified situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it goes back, to the analogy of the straw that breaks the camel's back. Okay, so when things go wrong, very often people, when they come to do root cause analysis, will look at the last straw, and that's the cause. And in reality, it isn't. It's just the tipping point. It was just the last straw, as we know. But prior to that, there was a whole sequence of events or a combination of events that led to that point, that breaking point. So root cause analysis you should never make the error of looking at the last straw. You need to go back and look through the actual sources and the root. So tools such as the 5Y, 6Y fishbone diagrams are specifically designed to make you do that, to force you to look beyond the last straw. Yeah.
Okay. Question from Charles. We're an organised, unionised facility, have not had luck getting frontline operators to volunteer for internal audit team. Any suggestions?
No, it's a short answer. It's an industrial relations issue. I expect it has to be handled in that way. Management and trade unions would need to negotiate that. I don't have any concept. I used to be a student union officer in my early days, so we tended just to get things done by marching on the streets and kicking up a fuss, but not very civilized. I wouldn't suggest that.
Somebody's mentioned incentivizing it. Have you any views on incentivizing, like the audit team?
Look, I won't. No, fundamentally I wouldn't incentivize them on the output or performance of the audits. It tends not to work. So that's a whole debate. That is a whole discussion in its own right. I think, how do you incentivize people to get outcomes? My experience over the years working in food companies where I've seen in meat companies for sure, it tends to happen more. It's no guarantee that you get the outcome you want or the standards that you want. That's my experience. Yeah.
Okay. This is slightly off topic, but since you're here, George, I know you'll know the answer anyway. Tariq, please, I need elaboration about the difference between verification and validation. Can you give an example or two of the difference, or just? Yeah,
okay. It's a very common one. Most people get confused with it. I still do myself. I have to reset every time I approach it. Okay, so validation is about. It's very simple. It's seeking to answer a question, and the question is very simple: are we doing what we said we would do? Okay, so if we say that we're going to clean this machine every day using this chemical, and we want to get this result from a swab. Okay, that's your plan that you've defined, and verification is simply checking that that's what you've done. That's all, and you've either done it or you haven't. It's very simple. That's verification. Have we done what we said we wanted to do, and without any further questions being asked or any other insight being sought? Okay. Validation asks a different question, and that question is what we said that we would do, is it in fact capable of producing safe food product? So if you can see the difference between the two. So it's not interested in whether or not you do it. It's just saying, if we do it, will it actually produce safe product? Is it sufficient? Is the efficacy there to actually achieve the result, which is safe food product? And that's the second question, and that's the difference between the two. So it's like buying a car. If you want to do 100 miles an hour or 100 kilometers an hour going to work, you'll buy a car to do that, for example. So verification will be just actually checking that in fact it can reach the 100 kilometers an hour. You might stand at the side of the roads like the police and clock that time. Yeah. Okay. So that's verification. But you may then, for validation, ask the question, well, actually, is 100 hours fast enough for me to get to work in the first place on time? So I hope maybe that analogy helps a little bit. Yeah.
Yep, it does for me as well, because I always get confused. Adhita, would you like to explain how to validate the effectiveness and robustness of checklists to obtain strong findings during our internal audit activities? How do you ask the right questions? So great question. So the answer depends on what the item is. So if it's a cleaning process, there's a very clear way of doing that, which we just don't have time to go into today. But you would define the procedures. You would actually do tests and inspections. You might even use statistical analysis to measure how confident the process is. I think we did a presentation on cleaning validation. Did we, Simon, at some point? If we haven't, it might be worth doing. Yeah. We did. I'm sure we did. Somebody asked also some of the resources you mentioned. We'll put links in the follow-up webinar to. Right. Yeah. So I'll have a look. Yeah.
Okay. So there's many different ways of doing this. One, you can do things such as challenge testing, micro testing, various other testing, just to double check that what is being said is done is in fact capable of doing what you wanted to do. Okay. Other things just purely could be just visual inspection. There's many different ways of doing this. Challenge testing, as I think I mentioned. Okay, so looking at finished product results, looking at customer complaints. So it really depends on what the actual item is that you want to validate. And
yeah, okay. Suman, just going back to validation and verification. Validation is before doing the activity, and verification is after the activity.
No, that's just the description of when you do them.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
That's the timing. But the person is correct. You would do your validation before you get into your verification, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Irina, is there a standard that defines a frequency for internal auditor training?
Not that I'm aware of, to be honest. Again, you could probably just, that's not such a difficult one. Internal audit training is usually based on experience, but there are usually one-day courses and even 2-day courses for internal auditing practices. So I've seen them around. There's loads of them online. So for internal audits, you don't need to do weeks and weeks of training.
IFSQN have got a 4-hour one, actually.
Actually, there you go. Yeah. That was the next thing I was going to say, Sam. So, but that is actually that's the best approach. Usually, refresher training, it depends again, but that's anywhere between 1 and 2 years. Yeah.
Okay, Dilanka. We got there. Audits assist in identifying root cause, and it might lead to long. We've already answered that one, I think. Just to say, there's been lots. I've skipped past them, but there's been lots of praise in the sidebar for the presentation itself, George. So
thanks everybody.
I think everybody's got a lot out of it. Can't see any more now. So well done, George. Thanks. I know it went a bit astray at the beginning. I thought it was you that had disappeared, and it was actually me. But never mind. I'll edit that blooper out. So thanks. Sorry about that technical problem, and thanks for your time today, George. I appreciate it.
Yep. No, thanks for the invitation, Simon. I appreciate it, and looking forward to the next one.
Yep. Cheers. Have a nice weekend, George.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, that was George Howlett from SafeFood 360. We will follow up afterwards with the recording. I'll have to edit that blooper out at the beginning, but give me a couple of hours. We'll edit that out. We'll send the email to you with the recording, the slides, the certificate of attendance, and we'll put those links in that we refer to webinars and resources on SafeFood 360 website. Thanks for joining today. And as ever, you're such an engaging audience. You always, the comment stream, it's just wonderful to see. It does, the feedback that you provide, it does make it a whole thing rather than it being a one-way sort of diatribe. So next week, we've got our final webinar of 2020. We are putting a program together for 2021, so we're not going away. We'll have plenty more topics for you next year. But the last one next week is testing for microbial contamination in ambient air. And that's from Maria Sandoval at Trace Analytics. So we look forward to that. All I've got to say is have a great Friday. Enjoy the rest of the Friday. Have a lovely